Invisible Experts Podcast.
Oh, so hello, Amanda. How are you?
Good. So good to see you, Andres.
How's it going? Long time no
Going.
see in person, right?
Yeah, we're overdue for an in-person meetup.
I know, finally. So, we've met, wow, almost 6 years ago, right?
Oh, it might have been more than that,
It
right?
more,
Good Market. Good
yeah,
Good
7
Market
years, I think.
celebrates. Yeah. Good Market celebrated 10 years 2 days ago. And you
Oh,
were there during
wow.
the early days. So it was a while ago. Yeah.
It was fantastic because when I was first of all, thank you for participating on this. We are
Yeah.
really glad like having you. And we were thinking, okay, who would be the first person to invite to do this? And we thought about you. So we really appreciate this. And I was looking at your profile and all your accreditations and big experience, and it's very interesting to see, um, how much you've been working for the ecosystem, right? Like you've been from university lecturer, then program director, Ashoka fellow, and you have a lot of board memberships, right? And of course the good market, which is a big thing. And so I don't know how you call you, like Amanda or Dr. Kiessel.
No, just Amanda. Oh, come on. Just Amanda.
So how are you doing nowadays? So how is the good market? How is the SEWF? Is it by social or is it because you're doing like board member by social, USA, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you want me to share a little bit about
Sure,
maybe
please tell us
what
what,
good
what you're
market
up to
is?
now. No,
Because
we're gonna get there later. But I want to know what you're doing nowadays.
right now, so Good Market's not just me, right? It's a commons, it's thousands of people involved, right? But I'd say I'm kind of in a steward role, right? Of like protecting the commons. And that is very much the more than full-time work. That's where all the energy is going. But because Good Market's set up to serve lots of different networks and community groups and all of that, I'm really lucky because I get to interact with all of these different groups and networks in different parts of the world. So my day-to-day work is, stewarding and supporting Good Market, but that means that I get to support all these other networks, which is just so much fun. It gives, especially when the news is really bad, being in this space and having kind of this bird's eye view of what's happening in the ecosystem and what our movement basically, it gives a lot of energy, right? Like I get to constantly learn about new groups doing fantastic work. It helps. It helps on the days when there's so many challenges we're dealing with, just to remember how many people are out there doing this kind of work. Yeah.
So you moved back from Sri Lanka to the US just before the pandemic, am I right?
Not exactly. So
Okay, wow. I just really
we
bad
knew,
informed.
yeah, we knew that, so I've been in Asia the last 20 years, and we knew that for this next stage, and we have a lot of things in Sri Lanka that are on the ground, right? There's like shops, and there's a whole network with farmers, and there's the events and all of that. And there's a whole team there, a Sri Lankan team that's doing all of that work. And we knew that for this next stage, we were going to have to spend more time outside of Sri Lanka, right? So visiting people or connecting with people in different places. So we've been slowly kind of getting ready to spend more time outside of the country. And so we'd actually moved we've been in Colombo. We moved up into the hills and stayed on a farm to be like a little bit away so the team could like get more. And what happened is we were in the US for a meeting in March 2020. And Sri Lanka is an island, so they completely closed. So the airport closed.
Oh, wow.
And we hadn't fully planned a proper transition. Like I haven't lived in the US in 20 years. There's no health insurance, no transport, no
Oh
housing, nothing.
gosh.
So it's not like we exactly like did it in a proper way and moved. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
But like it seems that a lot of things is happening in the US since you moved there. because I just read you are a member of the board member of the Bisocial USA,
Yeah,
and also
yeah.
you happen to be an outstanding alumni in IMC, right? Right? Wow,
No,
that
so
happened so quick.
yes, well, no, so a lot of the relationships, and this is the thing, like the even when we're in Sri Lanka, we were working with networks and organizations all over the world, right? But there's certainly been, and in a way, this probably makes me feel even more strongly about how important this work is. I have noticed that physically being in the US, it is a lot easier for me to be part of certain conversations or to be able to get on calls with big groups. They take it more seriously when I'm physically in the US, which to me is like yet another sign of how much inequality we still have. And even though this isn't, there's a lot of things I miss about a whole community being in Sri Lanka. I feel like being useful, I am more useful for everybody being here right now because it's opening up more opportunities. It's opening up, new networks, things like that. So yeah, so from that perspective, it's been very good. There's a lot of really fun things happening around different trade opportunities for social enterprises and things like that, that I'm actually more useful here, even though this wasn't fully planned.
So how was your outstanding alumni I don't know, award or something? That was your
Oh,
university, right? IMC.
oh, no, I'm not,
No, it's not because I just
yeah, yeah.
uh,
Yes, so there have, yes, it's been nice to be able to reconnect with some of those groups, right? But
so
but
how it
honestly, like
happened. They
I'm
just
not I'm not the story, right? Like my role is really just to be able to support and amplify all of the great work that everyone else is doing. So I don't
oh
usually
my
talk about
God.
anything I'm doing personally.
No, but I think it's really interesting because I was wondering when I read things how they found you. Like they just found you online and then they just called you on, or how did it work?
I think in that case, so we actually have a lot of, I grew up in northern Michigan, so that's in that area. And we have a lot of groups on the Good Market platform from that area that are doing fantastic work. So there was a little visibility about Good Market, I think, in that area. So that might have been part of it. So we have like there's local cooperatives and local organic farms and things like that are on Good Market. So I
Okay,
think that's
great.
why it became more visible. Yeah.
No, but look, because to be honest, I really want to talk. Oh, sorry. Uh-oh, that's something weird happened there. I don't know what. Wait. No, that was odd, right? Because I wanted to talk about also you as a person. Okay, I've seen a lot of videos and uh, like you on camera talking about the good market. When I was doing my research about Amanda, your experience, which is great, and of course we're gonna talk about the good market. But then I was wondering, in the first place, what's the story about the journey to end up in Sri Lanka? Because from the US, hello?
I can hear
Oop,
you.
yes.
Yep.
It's just because I have a frozen screen. No, it's good. So what's the story? How do you ended up in Sri Lanka in the first place?
Um, so, gosh, so I went there planning to spend 8 months back in 2002, and I had been doing a lot of work with like regenerative agriculture and food systems and things like that. And I went there to help out with a particular project. And there are kind of two things going on. One is there had been a ceasefire in the country. So you know what that means, coming from Colombia, like what a big deal that is, right? And so they just felt like outside everyone said it's not going to last, but inside there was this feeling that something was changing. And it was like the checkpoints were coming down. It was a really exciting time. And the organization that I was there to work with is a local organization. I was there to work with for this short period. they were working in a lot of the conflict affected areas. And so they asked me to stay on to continue helping because they had been getting a lot of donor money during the war, and they expected that that money was going to stop now that the war was over. And so they were trying to think, we weren't using the word social enterprise. This is 2002, right? We weren't using the word social enterprise then, but it was how could they have a self-sustaining model so they could keep supporting the communities even if there's no outside funding, right? That's why they asked me to stay on. So that's the reason. It's like, you know, if you're in a situation where you can be useful, right? And it's aligned with your values and you feel like it's something that you could contribute, that was the reason for staying on. And then from there, you know, there were just so many, for example, like even meeting you or all of these other groups that were passing through, there were so many opportunities with that as a base to be able to learn from and connect with other people doing this kind of work, even in other countries. So that's how it became kind of home based. There's
Wow.
lots of other reasons, but that's the core reason.
And also, like, I was thinking, you know, maybe for anybody who has been in Sri Lanka, you know, of course, you spent there 20 years, almost 20 years. So how's the culture? I mean, it was like a big change for you when you moved there, you know, in relation to the culture, the food, the language. Was it easy?
Oh, I'd been in Thailand for 2 years before that.
Okay,
and
that's
I'd been
interesting.
in a rural area, right? And I'd learned Thai and was in a rural area, and it was very, very similar to it's the southern part of Thailand. There were a lot of similarities. So actually that transition, learning Sinhala is a lot easier than learning Thai, or learning Tamil is easier than Thai. So that part wasn't a big transition. And I'd also been working in an Asian office, which is a very different culture, I think, than, so that part wasn't, for Sri Lanka wasn't hard, right? I'd already done the hard part of kind of
Um,
adapting to that, you know.
So, from your perspective, of course, how is Sri Lankan culture? Like, if you could maybe like describe it.
I think one of the things that that makes it really special is for the size, just how incredibly diverse it is, right? So, and in some ways, like diverse in terms of language, the different regions having, you know, it's very different agroecological zones, right? So in one small place, you can have all these different kinds of people are producing different kinds of food. There's all these sectors, different religions, four main religions, right? So it's very diverse in that sense. But there's a lot of things about it that make it particularly special because there's not that same disconnect that you get in some countries between with the traditional culture, because it's small enough that even people in urban areas still have some connection to rural areas, and they can see. I think part of it that makes it special is it's small enough that you can kind of you feel connected to the whole island. Do you know what I mean? Like if you okay, so this
Wow.
this is going to sound crazy, but if you think about like planet Earth as an island, we have we have this finite space, and we all have to learn how to live together, and we all have to learn how to live with nature, right? Sri Lanka is like that in a microcosm, right? It's like in a
Wow.
very area, right? Where you can you've probably been to most parts of the island. You can kind of picture it. It's small enough that you could actually talk to people in government. Whereas in a place like India, it's really hard to shift policy. So there were just a lot of things that are really exciting about having a space where people were really working for change, but they were actually trying to push for new policies and do all these things. I don't know. There were lots of reasons that Sri Lanka is a very, very special place.
Wow. Wow. And for instance, when you start, I mean, of course, I mean, I suppose you kind of like build up your own personality, having had this kind of like, you know, like this kind of culture, how do you embed this culture within your persona throughout the time? Because after 20 years, you know, you could be even Sri Lankan, right?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people. I mean, I'm sure you're also kind of in this position, but there's a lot of people that are kind of in betweeners, right? Where they're part of multiple cultures. You get to the point where you're kind of you're more of a global citizen, you're part of a multiple cultures, and there's never a place that's 100% home,
Yeah.
because you'll miss the part of the other place, right? So for example, I noticed that when if I'm in South Asia for really long stretches, as a female, I take up less space. I speak in a quieter way, right? And I'll tell you, it's really nice if I'm in the US and I go out on a trail all by myself and I can walk freely and I feel like I can.
Yep.
It's different
Wow.
being a female in America than it is in South Asia. That's just a reality, right? And so there's little bits of like things you miss if you're in one space, and things you miss in the other space. And that's part of being, between worlds, the people who are in kind of pollinator roles or bridging roles or things like that, where you have bits of you that are, connected to all these different cultures. So that's definitely the case.
Wow, that's an excellent point because, I was thinking, being like white, okay, being American, and also like, being a female in,
Yeah,
in such a small place. Uh,
it's
I
it was
presume
a
it
lot
could be like
easier.
overwhelming, right?
Yeah, it was a lot easier. So I spent 10 years working mostly in rural areas.
Wow.
And that was actually very easy because if you're in a if you're in a rural area, everybody's like, oh, that person looks a little bit different, but they all know who they are. And so you're just, you know what I mean? It's just kind of accepted.
Yeah.
So in a rural area, I'm a familiar face. I'm surrounded by, it doesn't feel so much like you're an outsider. When Good Market started, and a lot of it was about helping with market access, so we're trying to like help rural producers access urban markets. I started spending more time in an urban area. That was actually really hard. I struggled a lot being in that setting because everywhere you go, you're reminded that you're other. You know what I mean? Whereas in a rural area, you know everybody, and it's just like you're
Yeah.
all humans all working on something together. And when I would be in an urban area where you're constantly encountering, different, just on public transport or in different places, you're constantly being reminded that you look differently or that you don't fit in. So that definitely was hard. But that was much more, you know, in the city. That was not so much my experience in rural
So
areas.
do so do you reckon when you were in the city you feel a bit more observed rather than when you were in the rural area?
More like an object, less like a person, right? Like more
Okay,
like,
again.
yeah. So, and yeah, when I was in rural areas and the people you're working with and you're all working together on something, you don't feel foreign in the same way. You just feel like we're all working together on something. So, but in a city, you're constantly bumping up into different people, and it was more challenging. It was more challenging.
Because to be honest, when we met you, we were amazed because we thought, wow, it must have been a massive challenge, okay, to be from outside, from overseas, and then, generate such a beautiful project, you know, and also like being a female, okay, because I think we were really amazed. I think it must be a bit challenging at time, I
Oh,
suppose.
I think part of it is that though. I would never have seen it as I wasn't generating anything, right? Because my
Okay,
role was just to support groups that were there doing great work, right?
okay.
And they were at the front, not me, right? So even with the team, it was about like I would join them for meetings in the beginning and get them more comfortable. But the goal has always been about them being able to tell their own story and be able to represent them. So it was never me like generating. It's more like kind of a supporting role, connecting to other information or resources or opportunity, but the spotlight is on them. So I think, yeah, if I went in thinking that I was a founder of something, that would have not
No,
worked, right? I'm a supporter. I'm like, I'm a steward. I'm like trying to just help amplify the amazing work that they all were doing. That was more the focus, right?
no, of course. But what I mean is like, it's as important as, have the island, and as it's important to be the bridge. Okay.
Yeah.
So being the bridge is also hard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
it's hard.
by all
Yeah.
means, I understand, the role that you generate, you facilitate this kind of networking, perhaps you were like blending yourself into the culture. But it's very interesting how, you became from, I mean, you kind of like have this transition from local to global, right? Because
Yeah.
the good market is global now. And we're gonna talk about this. But I wanted to ask you about this kind of like, you know, perhaps process in your life when you were like seeing the end of a civil war. Because having understood what you said, you got there 2002, right?
Yeah.
And the civil war finished in 2009. Six. Oh,
Yes. So 2002 was a ceasefire, which is
oh
why it felt like
wow.
there was a lot of energy. And then the tsunami happened, and then
Exactly.
the civil
Yeah.
war started again. So I was there during the stage of fighting from really about 2006 until 2000, and then really it took another 2 years before the resettlement process was even close to being finished. So from 2006 to 2011 was a very intense, and 2005, 2006 was busy because of the tsunami, right? So
Wow.
yes, it was a very, very intense period.
I know, and also like, look, I see our sector, the sustainable businesses, social enterprises, it's just a name, how, it can work as a tool, for this particular context where there is conflict or there was a conflict, and I was, like relating to my background, okay, being
Yeah, yeah,
Colombian and see this kind of peace process and then moving to the post-conflict.
yes.
This transition must be hard. So I think, initiative as the good market, it provides a platform
Yeah.
for people to start to rebuild their lives, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because this was a big challenge. So I mentioned before, the reason I stayed on with that organization is they wanted to shift to a self-sustaining model. So this has always been my interest. I'm interested in, things that are like system work, long-term, sustainable, all of that, which is very different than emergency response relief work, which is what, because of the situation, that's what we ended up doing, right? And so it was really hard during during natural disaster and during a wartime.
Wow.
It's really a hard time for people to be able to think. I mean, you can't even, there's so many like checkpoints and things like that. You can't transport your goods to market. Like it's almost impossible just to function, right? So it's a hard time to be building up social enterprises. And so what would happen, and then there's the whole issue of international aid coming in, right? So you would have a place that maybe before the tsunami, people were doing self-sustaining activities. And then they have a whole period where there's a huge amount of grant funding coming in. And then the mentality shifts. And instead of like with my community, how do we get together and solve a problem? It's like a handout waiting for support, or we have to write a project proposal first before we do anything. There's like this whole mentality shift that happens, that kind of wipes out that collective action of solving problems together. So that was also really frustrating during that whole period. And I think we would find little pockets, like places where it was still more stable, there would still be activities going on, right? So there's a fantastic, fair trade and organic groups that work with huge networks of farmers. And so like they were in stable areas, things were still going. You get energy from, okay, here's like this longer term work that's happening. Or we visit friends like in India, or visit friends in Thailand, or Myanmar, different places, and be like, okay. So you just kind of get recharged from people who were able to focus on the longer term work. But the part that was so special about when things finally ended, when there was more stability, when there was relative peace, is there's this sense when you're in a country that's seen as like a mess or seen as violent, and I'm sure you can relate to this, where it affects your sense of pride in your own country to a certain extent. And there was just this powerful feeling of, when the event first started, one, of being able to have people come out in a public space. Like there had been security issues with gathering in groups, right? So to have people come out, interact face to face, have people there from all the different ethnicities and languages and all of that all in one space, different economic groups in one space interacting with each other. That was incredible. But then this pride, being able to rebuild a sense of being proud of being Sri Lankan, of what the traditions are, what the products are, look what our enterprises are doing, and being proud of that period, like after the war, that was incredible to just be a tiny piece of that transition. And now you watch this whole next generation that's coming up post-conflict, who everything they're doing is about being proud of where they're from, and it's magic. It's so fun to see. Yeah.
Wow.
So yes, I think in that during an actual conflict situation, in the heat of being in an area that's dealing with right now conflict, it is very challenging to run things as a social enterprise.
Wow.
Right? But as you're recovering from that, and we've seen this all over the world, like, in Christchurch after after the earthquake, it's just like this huge emergence of social enterprises. And in Sri Lanka after the war, same thing, just incredible. Yeah.
Like, just to contextualize to the audience. So, what was what was the actual conflict? It was in between. I mean, generally speaking, it was in between two ethnicities, right? Or it was more complex than this.
I think that's how it gets reported, right?
Okay.
In the international news, I think that's a way of simplifying it, right?
Yeah.
There is a deep history of there was a divide and rule history during the British colonial period, very similar to what happened in Rwanda. And when they transitioned out, they left certain structures in place that led to this kind of, there were certain things about shifting to majority rules with no minority protections, and the way that the structures were left. It's different than a country or community coming up with laws that match their context versus being in a colonial situation where you've taken in certain laws from outside that might not match what your particular context is. So there's a lot of deep-rooted things that kind of emerge from that time. And there were conflicts that happened in the South, Sinhala to Sinhala. There were conflicts that happened in the North, Tamil to Tamil. And the international news represents it as being an ethnic conflict, but there's a lot more complexity than
Exactly.
that.
Yeah.
It's rooted
That's why I
in
was
a lot of,
yeah.
yeah.
And also, like, from my experience, having, there's a tendency to simplify such conflicts, right? Because in Colombia, it's actually the same. People,
Yes.
it's super complex. There are a lot of dimensions. It's not as simple as we see it. Have you ever had like any scary situation where you were like, or it was kind of like, more peaceful,
I mean,
or
many, because
I mean, I
the
don't know if you
organization,
can talk about it, but it's
yeah,
really
the organization I worked with, for the first 10 years I was there, it was very unique because it was the only one that was able to work on both sides. It had relationships with the government, it had relationships with the Tamil Tigers. So it was able to work across the border and openly, very like transparently, everyone knew that it was working both sides. And that was unusual. And so that meant all of the people I'm working with are from the areas we're working, right? So like if there's a district, the coordinator, when the war was ending and many people were displaced and they were in camps, those were all people, my colleagues, and the communities I'd been working with were in the camps, and the colleagues were in the camps with the communities that they'd been working with. So what this meant is that there were a lot of situations where it was very sensitive and it was very risky all the time. But it's different than other places where I would have been putting people at risk. I think in some countries, having a foreigner there would have been harmful. In this case, if I'm in the vehicle and we're going through checkpoints, it would have made other people feel safer, right? So I think because it was very much connected to everybody that's there and you're all in it together, and also because when and this is something everyone needs to be aware of in every country. When democracy starts slipping and when things start getting violent, it's not like it's usually all of a sudden. It's something that's just like this gradual process, right? And so you don't realize how bad it is until sometimes maybe if you travel outside or you like really deep in it, and then you're like, oh wow, now the situation is actually really bad. Because on a day-to-day basis, you manage. Everybody's like, you're trying to get the kids to school, you're trying to get people trying to go to work, and you're still trying to like have normal life, right?
Wow.
And so the day-to-day feels normal. There are a lot of situations that feel stressful and you can be a little bit worried about, but you're around others that are also going through the same thing. Do you know what I mean? So it's a different feeling. It was the same thing. I don't know if this is relevant, but it was like the same thing after the tsunami. Sri Lanka lost like 35,000 people, right? And yeah, and there were people who were in Sri Lanka. It was after the ceasefire, so there were tourists coming, right? So there were people in Sri Lanka who were there as tourists, right? And then they went back to their countries. And of course, they didn't lose their homes, they didn't lose livelihoods, they didn't lose as many, like all of this, they in that way weren't as affected as much, obviously. But what happened in Sri Lanka is you're surrounded every day by people who have went through the same thing. They've also had loss, and over again through the next the many months, everyone tells their stories. Where were you? What happened? Who you lost, and you remember them, and you have ceremonies, and you're all there together having this experience, right? And so I would meet people years later that had been in Sri Lanka during the tsunami, and it had completely it had kind of derailed their life because they went back to a place where no one understood that experience. Whereas if you're in a place where everybody's trying to get through on their day-to-day life and going through it together, there's a support system that you have for each other. You tell stories, you talk about what's going on, you know what I mean? And so it doesn't look like it looks on the news and it doesn't feel on a day-to-day basis as dramatic. It feels like we're all in this together and we're trying to get through this,
Wow. So where were you when the tsunami happened?
So the 2 years before that, I'd actually been on the beach. So it's the day after Christmas, right? So it's the day after Christmas, which is like the one day off, right? Like we worked crazy hours. And so it was like an actual day off. And the 2 years before that, I'd stayed on the beach. That year, I was staying about a kilometer inland and I was learning how to surf. So you've met Steven, my partner, right? So at that time I was learning how to surf and we were gonna get up in the morning that we had a meeting in a village. There was a conflict between tourism and fisheries and we were gonna have a meeting in the village. We pushed that meeting back so we could go surfing in the morning, okay? And when the alarm went off to go surfing,
wow,
I was lazy and I was like, well, maybe not today. Let's just turn the alarm off. And so we didn't go. And when we turned out to go towards that meeting in the village on the coast, people were running in and they were saying the waves came. No one knew the word tsunami, right? So they were all like, the waves came, and didn't have any idea what was going on. Like could not figure out what was going on. Everything was down, like phones are down, everything's down. So we couldn't make it to that village and we still couldn't figure out what was happening. And we ended up trying to get back to Colombo. It was hours before we finally understood what had happened. We got through to a radio and it said something about Indonesia. And we're like, what could possibly be going on in Indonesia?
wow.
We had no idea what was happening, right? But we lost people that we were supposed to be meeting with that day, people that we've been working with, because they made it to the village on time. We were really, really, really lucky.
So that was totally unexpected. They didn't see any, you know.
I think in places, so like in the Andaman Islands, where the traditional stories had passed through more, where there hadn't been like the same disruptions, everyone knew that if the sea went out, you run up to high ground, right? Like that had been passed along and they had very few deaths. In Sri Lanka, the sea went out and everybody ran towards it. Like they were like looking at the fish and like trying to like, oh, look at this. And they all ran out towards it. People didn't know. Now, of course, people know, but it had been many years since there'd been a tsunami in the Indian Ocean of that scale. So that, yeah, people had no idea what was going on at
Wow,
first.
that's crazy. Gosh.
Crazy.
So imagine this kind of like experience. Okay, you have the tsunami, then you have kind of like the war is ended. So how do you guys develop such a beautiful idea as the good market? How do you guys come across with this idea? Because it's amazing, right? As you say, as you said before, I mean, you are not able to think because of you are kind of in shock. And then, how do you guys come up with this idea?
I mean, I don't feel like this isn't an individual idea, right? All these
No,
things
no,
develop
I mean, I see the
conversations.
group,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And also just like you end up having conversations over and over, and it's like, oh, this pattern keeps coming, this pattern keeps coming. So I think a big part of it was during the war. So at that point, I'd say I was still kind of focused on individual social enterprises and initiatives, right? But it was during the war. I mentioned like a way to recharge was to go and visit other groups doing this kind of work in other parts of the world. So if there was going to be any trip, so say we had to go for a conference somewhere, we would plan the conference so that you could go visit everybody doing amazing work in that area, right? And we were finding, if you searched online and you tried to find people that you could visit, I mean, you know this because this is the whole Minka journey, was this kind of thing, right? If you searched for who's doing this kind of work, it could be really hard because people were using different words. And if it's like for example, a good example was Japan. We were going to go to Japan for something, and then we're like, well, let's try and visit all the other groups that were doing this kind of work. It's in Japanese. Like, how do you search for it? How do you find it? And what happens is, if you tap into this movement and you ask who in that community, who else is doing this, they all know, right?
Yeah.
Because so it might not be visible outside, but within, it's like, who else is doing this work? And so they say, oh, you should talk to this person. And you meet with them and you say, who else should we visit? And they say, oh, you should meet. So you know this part of the story. So it was starting to come from things like that, of being like, oh wow, this is a truly global movement across every sector, across all countries. And when I'm saying movement, what I mean by that is, we've been told this economic story that the purpose of everything, the purpose of the economy, the purpose of business, the purpose of our individual lives is to try and maximize profit or income, to try and accumulate wealth, to extract, right? Like this is the goal. That's how you measure success, right? And what we're finding is there's just all over the world, there's people who are choosing to make work in a different way. They're choosing to put people and planet first, right? Both in their own daily lives, but also in the work they're doing, right? And it's that's the shift, right? That's how we're like slowly starting to co-create some kind of a new economy. But the thing is you can't, it's still not fully visible. It's visible if your eyes are trained for it, which I know yours are, right? But it's still not visible for a lot of people because it's bottom up. So it's fragmented. So you'll have, the people working on food, or you'll have people working on fashion, or you have, they're working in only Spanish, so they don't know what's happening in other places, for example. Or I'm using the word social enterprise, or I'm using cooperative, or I think nonprofit, like it could be divided up in that way, or what certifications you have. I'm the fair trade community. I'm, like, because of that, we can't see sometimes that we're actually all part. We've got this shared core value and purpose that we're all, whatever language we're using, that we're all working around and trying to do things that are good for people and planet. So I think it was like starting to meet all these groups and be like, oh wow, this is bigger than we realized. And then talking about how can we make this more visible, and how can we make it easier for people doing this work to find and connect with each other. So that was the first piece. The part about right now, it's set up very much to serve networks and community groups and all of that. That came a little later, of like that, like, oh, this is the way it needs to go. But the first step was that, is like, how do we make it visible? How can we make it easier for people to find each other? That was, it came up through that during the war was when it really came up.
Okay, so you always, of course, you said you were part of a group. So who were who were those people? I mean, how do you meet them? How do you started to, because I suppose to set something like this, You have to build trust. You have to be
Yeah.
like this kind of sense of at least community, right? Or friendship. So who are
Yeah.
those people?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of entry points through different networks. So you find other organizations and networks that are kind of moving in this direction. Some of them it's a direct relationship with the organizations, but often, so for example, like the World Fair Trade Organization, that's been doing work. There's certain groups that have been doing this for decades, right? So there's things around that. There's IFOAM is the International Federation of Organic Agriculture Movements. We're part of an engaged Buddhist group that links with all different religions and is working on, across religions to address problems. So there'd be like little bits of like, oh, here's a network, people working on regenerative agriculture, permaculture. You'd find like little bits of, like I said, it's fragmented. So at first it's starting to just kind of be like, which organizations are doing this, which, networks are doing this. And there's a lot of, you're building up relationships. But then from that, once you start realizing, okay, we've got these shared values, it becomes a lot easier, to start connecting with other groups. And like I said before, it's all about, it's in research and academia, they'd call it the, snowball method, right? When you're talking to somebody, you say, who else should we talk to, right? That's a huge piece of how things started out in the beginning. It's like, who else is doing this? Who else do you think is doing amazing work? And then once Good Market started, and it became something like when we started with the event, but then even when it went online, at this point, we thought we kind of knew who was available in the space. And when it got put out there and people could apply and could be part of it, all of a sudden, all these groups started coming out that we didn't even know existed. And that's been
Wow.
the best part, because it's just like, you start realizing just how many people are working to make things better, right? Like much bigger scale than I think we ever anticipated.
Wow, that's fantastic. Like I remembered your talk at the SEWF in Scotland.
Mhm.
Okay, and I remembered you talk about this diffusion. What was it? A diffusion of innovation
Yes.
theory.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep. Yep.
so
Yep.
I was trying to connect this theoretical, framework with the way that you were explaining the good
Yeah.
market.
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
so I
Yep.
was thinking, I want to ask you how much this theory has to be in the way the good market was eventually developed, or it was
It's
just a way to explain the good market.
no, it's very much connected.
Okay,
because
wow,
because
okay,
if you look, like I had all this on the ground work that was happening. And obviously that completely changes your way of understanding the world, right? Because it's human interactions. But I also did a master's and a PhD, right?
wow, okay,
And
okay, hold
I
on.
used
But
that
let's
as a
let's
chance.
explain. Okay, let's explain the audience first. What is that about? In a very simple words, though. What is it? Diffusion of innovation theory.
Yeah,
What
so
is
that's what I
this?
was gonna say. So
Okay,
these two things come together, right? Like
okay.
the thing, if you're trying to understand how does change happen, so all of us together, we're a social system, right? Social economic system, right? And we're a complex system. It's constantly changing, right? And it's not as simple as you put in, it's not like you put in A plus B and you get C. It's a complex system. You can't predict it. It's constantly changing. And in a situation like that, how do you have change in society, right? How have social movements worked in the past? How do new ideas spread through society? And so I used the time when I was doing things that were like academic research to try and get a deeper understanding of what do we know about that, right? And there's a number of different things. This is just one, right? But an example of how things spread is they did work on, it came out of agriculture actually. How do new agriculture ideas spread? This is back in, I think the 40s and 50s. And it's like, you have early adopters, you have innovators, early adopters, then there's the early majority, late majority, and what they call laggards, people who are really slow to adopt a new technology. And if you look, just about any idea that kind of flows through society, that pattern is there, right? Now, you might be an early adopter in one area and not in another area, right? Like you might be, or an innovator in one area. So you might be like the first person to start bringing your own bag to the supermarket, but you might have a really old phone, right? So you're like a laggard on technology things. So it's not like you're always one thing. But the point is that any change that's pushing through, you have this innovator and early adopter as like the first group, right? And what we're learning is when you hit a certain point, and it's not 100% of the society, it looks like it's like usually between 10 and 15%. A lot of you hit kind of a tipping point and change shifts really fast through society. So we've seen this, for example, just like shifts in norms around LGBT communities as a really great example of all this work by people kind of pushing and pushing and pushing, who are the innovators and early adopters for years, and then getting to a certain point where things start to tip, right? So when we're talking about this work, it's the same thing, right? We've got all of these innovators and early adopters, some of whom have been working for decades and just doing amazing work, and we have to recognize them, right? Like we have to celebrate them and all the foundations that they've built. Like this is the roots of where, this is what we're building off of, right? And now we're at a stage where we have a lot more people who are seeing what's happening in the world, in their own communities, with the climate, with the political situation, with all these things. And they're wanting to be able to do more. And they all have different things that kind of bring them there. Sometimes it's when they have kids, sometimes it's like they're retiring. It's different things are happening in people's lives where they're kind of thinking, this doesn't feel right. We want to do things in a different way. And so the whole thing is about, if we can make the first group, the innovators and early adopters, more visible, make it easy for them to connect, make it strengthen the work that they're doing, and then make it super easy for all the early majority people to get involved, right? So that's where it's coming from. That's how the two things are connected. Might be more
Wow.
information if you wanted.
No, I know, no, but I was trying to make the connection, and now it makes sense. So, okay, so the good market started as a market, physical market, and so, or it wasn't.
The long-term plan was always to do something with tech that would be able to work across languages and across cultures and across sectors. That was the long-term picture, right? But we'd seen so many examples of things that got funding, and then like as a project, and then the funding stops and they stop. So it really mattered that it had some kind of a self-sustaining model, and that it had more of a lean startup approach, right? So that something you'll covering in all these future MBAs and things. So a lean startup approach where it was like really built into like testing it in a small way to see what works, right? So for the online platform, there needed to be some system of curation. It had to be community owned, it had to be free, it had to be some system that worked for that. And so with the marketplace, it was a test, right? It was like, if you have a curated marketplace where everybody meets these standards, they're all putting people and planet first, right? If you have a space like that, one, is anybody going to be interested? Does this curation process work? Are there enterprises that are working this way? Does this make sense for them? Are there people that want to support that? Does it make sense for them? So it was a way of like testing is curation, and we have a crowdsourced monitoring system. So with the marketplace, it was great because it was the thought was it was just going to be a small test. We thought there'd be maybe 10 stalls and it would be short term, and we were just going to see if it worked. What happened is people's livelihoods started depending on it. And it was like, oh my goodness, we can't stop this. Like for some people, this is their main market now. So we actually had to put the software plans on hold until we could get that to be fully self-sustaining and cover its costs. And honestly, that took like 5 years to get that fully up and going. But the thing that was really nice about that is all of the things that are now this online tool emerged from having weekly in-person meetings. We had paper applications in 3 languages, right? And
Wow.
we did this whole process, like, talking through all these different points. And from that, you find the patterns. So then by the time we were ready to go for software, one, there was a huge demand for it by that point. And we'd already been testing it like in person with the community. How does the crowdsourced monitoring work? How does this work? How does that work? We've been testing it. So it ended up being, I mean, it's still going. There's, and there've been many others that we've encouraged, like they're not all under the Good Market name, but they're all on the platform. So you can go find other marketplaces that were inspired by it that are now on the platform, but they don't go under the name. So it's still going in Sri Lanka.
Oh, wow.
And it's really fun. It's something I highly recommend. If you're in a country that doesn't have foreign aid or doesn't have big government support for this kind of work, this kind of marketplace is the lowest cost, easiest way to build community and build the movement in your local area. Because it takes almost nothing to set up. It's like everybody prepays for their stall, puts the money together, right? Has the space, and then people are meeting. It builds relationships, right? And it can cover its costs. So you don't need a big investment, right? It doesn't require some outside group coming in and supporting it. You're able to gather as a community to get something started. It was not planned, but it's been really good. It's been really fun.
Wow, that's interesting. But before going to the global thing, I was wondering, okay, this is gonna be a bit, okay, this is my perspective because I like to consume good products, okay, organic products, fair trade products, like products from the social enterprise, context, okay? But of course, they happen to be expensive.
Mm-hmm.
They are in comparison to the market, okay? So as an academic, okay, let's have this conversation. I was thinking, wow, okay, what we are building is fantastic, but I have the feeling that it's only available for certain social class, okay? Because when I went, okay, my experience when I went to a good market was fantastic. This guy, he had this kind of hipster style, they have these fantastic products because they were amazing, like really good products. But of course, I was thinking maybe, and it happens not only there, but everywhere, whether someone perhaps from a low income, families, they could actually afford it. So what do you think?
Yeah. So, and I'll just say on the good market experience that you had, I think you came after we'd switched to Central Colombo, right? And it was a long effort to get there. When we started, we were actually in a suburb area where it was a much lower income community, and all the customers were very much local and from that income class. So the vibe you would have gotten was after many years and after we'd shifted to have something in Colombo. So a couple things. One is there is an element of, if you look at a lot of products that we have, we are not paying the full cost of those products, right? So there is an actual truth in certain situations where the cost is going to be higher, because what's happening right now with a lot of the profit maximizing economy is they're taking the social environmental costs, them not covering healthcare, them not paying living wages, them not taking care of environmental protections, them using cheap petrochemical based ingredients instead of real ingredients, right?
Of course.
All of those things make the cost low, but the real social environmental cost is putting it out to us as a society. Right?
Excellent.
So there is an element of that where we have to be like eyes wide open. That is a real thing, right? Why there would be more cost if you actually do things in the right way and you pay people and you put ingredients in that are actually healthy for our bodies and all of those things, right?
I know, but this is what really frustrates me because, as a consumer,
Yeah, so let's get to the next piece. The part that's really fun about this space is that it's an ecosystem. So that means you've got all different groups trying to solve different aspects of the same of problems, right? And so what we would see happen is, like, maybe early days, we would have groups that had organic for export certification, which is expensive, and they would have higher costs, right? And they were solving a specific problem. At that time, you couldn't find organic products in Sri Lanka, for example, right? but their products might only be accessible to certain groups, right? But then what ends up happening is as this ecosystem develops, you'll have people say, well, actually, the problem I want to solve is I want to make an organic product affordable for everyone.
Yeah.
And so then what they do, so we'll start having groups where maybe they're not doing beautifully graded, sort the carrots and have them all perfect and look the same size. They have it look like a little funny shapes or things like that. Or maybe they grade it and they have, here's the expensive one that goes to the chef at the restaurant. And here's the one that, goes there. There's lots of different ways. And the best part, the part I'm the most excited about, is how many groups you're having that are specifically working on how to make it accessible for everyone. So they're setting things up as mutual aid. They're doing community gardens. They're doing community kitchens. So my experience has been that the people wanting to solve these problems are across all classes. And as we build up the ecosystem, you get more and more people who are like, I want to make sustainable, ethical clothing affordable for everybody. I'm going to solve the problem this way. And they have their niche that they focus on, right? Because it's an ecosystem. We've all got our little pieces that we're all working on together. So I would say certainly in the early days, as people were doing these kinds of products, the focus was on wealthier consumers and just passing on the price. As things keep evolving, you get people being very creative and trying to make things accessible and affordable for everybody. Actually, I'm like, India is a fantastic example. There are so many groups popping up, young entrepreneurs, right, who are focused on, and they don't have a lot of resources, and they're like, I want to make things so that they're available to people like me, right? So that's the problem they've picked to solve. And they're doing really creative things about personal care products or about let's figure out fashion that we can afford, but that meets these values, right? So I think it's easier to think about it as kind of an ecosystem approach and something that's moving and evolving over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course, of course. Because, like, this is one of my reflections, okay? Look, I love wine. In fact, we have a wine visit, on hold when you come and
Yeah.
visit us. And one of our friends, he happened to have natural wine, biodynamic wine, and so on. And it is a very expensive product.
Yeah.
It is, because the production is really expensive. So I was thinking, wow, what if, because of course it's also healthier, you
Yes.
know. So
I missed an important point. Yes. Yeah, you're
yeah,
reminding me of something very important. Go ahead.
no, I was thinking, how can I make this product, which is amazing, this product, and then available to anyone who happen to like wine that is natural and is good for your body. I mean, not in excess, right? I mean, I'm not
Yes.
saying like 3 or 4 bottles. So I was thinking maybe we need to think about it, how to make this kind of products available,
Well,
for.
so on just that specific case, you're finding groups, for example, that do community supported agriculture, right? Where maybe you spend some time volunteering at his vineyard and then you get the discounted rate because you put in your labor instead. So there's lots of people, when they pick a problem, there's lots of creative ways to solve it. But there's one more point that I missed out on that I think
Yeah,
is
yeah.
super important. It's also starting to shift our ideas about how we consume, right? And so if we're thinking from the, buy less, choose well, make it last perspective, all of a sudden, even those of us like me who don't have a huge income, we can choose to pick some products that we really love, that we have shared values with, that spark joy, right? Because we're gonna be very intentional about that, and we're gonna consume less things in other areas, right? So rather than having, we're being more intentional about our choices, and maybe that means buying the really, really nice type of wine as a treat, right?
Now,
We're gonna buy less, choose well.
wine, which by the way, I promise you're gonna try, and we're gonna visit our friends, okay? And you can see the whole process, which is amazing. Fantastic. So look, now I was looking at your statistics about the global platform, the Good Market platform, and you have almost 3,000 businesses registered, right? Within a plethora of sectors. You have this kind of certified way. So how you come from the local to the global? I know you mentioned that that was the plan anyway since day one, right?
Yeah.
So how was this transition? Because it's amazing.
Yeah, because it's like 90 countries now, which is just incredible, right? Which is
Almost
really
there,
fun.
almost
Yeah.
all the countries.
Yeah. So this is the part I mentioned earlier where we hadn't fully understood the network piece when we were first starting. So we knew it had to be make everyone more visible, make it easier to find and connect. I think the real breakthrough came when we're just infrastructure, right? We're not trying to duplicate the work that other community groups and networks are doing because the work they're doing is so critical to the movement, right? The ecosystem builders, so valuable. So what we are is we're just infrastructure that supports those ecosystem builders, right? And so the way things have been developed now, so if you go to the site, you see a directory and you see all the groups that are included, and then there's a marketplace with anything they want to share. It doesn't have to involve money. It could be, a link to something to visit or an event or a volunteer opportunity. It could be anything. So when we first started, it's the full directory, full marketplace. The way things are set up now is the groups that are a network, if they're an ecosystem builder, they have their own directory for their community, their logo, their story, and a marketplace for their community based on what their interests are. And when I'm saying community, that could be by place. It could be like a local city, or it could be a country, or it could be by practice. So for example, like the World Fair Trade Organization, or groups that are working on a particular, if somebody's working on like worker-owned cooperatives, that could be an example of, right? It could be your practice or your place, any kind of a network or community. And that's free, right? So it's set up so that they have a way to kind of showcase and highlight their community, encourage more people to get involved. And for that group, we're building out a lot of functionality. So this year, a huge amount of my time has gone to that. It's like, and what's amazing is because it's a commons, because it's set up as a digital commons, if one group invests to improve something, if one network invests to do new software or improve something, it benefits all the networks. They all get access to this additional service. So that means that right now, we have a lot of networks. So it could even be like we have marketplaces, we have retail outlets, we have member organizations, there's certifications, verifications, service providers, like all different kinds of groups that work with many. A lot of them are using Good Market as a tool. So they're the ones reaching out and getting their community on. So that's how it's scaled. So that's the simple telling it from now story. I will say that we had real challenges early on. I think there is an assumption that things that are software and global come out of US or Europe. And the fact that this is a full Sri Lankan team and emerged from Sri Lanka, it was a barrier to overcome in the early days because people who were, say, in Australia or the UK or the US, they'd think, oh, this isn't for me, that they're somehow different, from those social enterprises. And so that stage was really hard, right? To help them see that it's actually we're one movement, right? And also to help them recognize just the fantastic work that's being done in other countries and that we're all connected around this.
I know.
So we're now past that point. We're not having that conversation anymore, but there was a period where that was very, very hard. There's an assumption that certain types of things only come out of certain countries, and that's not my experience.
That's, like this is how I was thinking. Sometimes I have the feeling, okay, that even within our movement or within our sector, they are like this sort of social class, right?
Yeah.
And this is also disruptive because this is kind of like bottom up, if you wish.
Yeah.
When we see the world, this kind of global north, global south, difference, right? So sometimes they feel a bit, when innovation coming from the south, don't you think? Sometimes it happens.
Yep, that happens. And also helping people see that this is still part of the movement, right? One of the things I loved about the Social Enterprise World Forum in Brisbane this year is there was very strong decision-making by Indigenous groups. Like there was a whole committee of people from, Aboriginal communities and different things that they helped shape the conference and made sure that certain people were on the stage. And so there was this whole theme of like our community. We've heard the same thing from Maori community as well. Like our community has been working this way for thousands of years. Great that you finally caught up, right? And I'm starting to see, so Kate Rayworth from Donut Economics, she also spoke and she did an acknowledgement of that, of like, this is us kind of doing a rehab in the West and catching back up to like our core human traditions, right? So a shift in understanding that a lot of the principles we're going to need in the future to be able to live together, to be able to live on this planet, to actually be able to keep things going, are actually the deepest roots in our traditional cultures. And I feel like that in the last few years, I'm slowly starting to see. Right? When a brilliant idea comes from, I don't really like the term global South, but when a brilliant idea comes from the global South, everyone can just see it as a brilliant idea, right? Without being like, oh, for that, it's for that part of the world.
Yeah,
Do you know what I
I
mean?
know. It's crazy, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's one of the barriers we have to kind of like tear down.
Yeah,
And
and that was a big, so one of the big motivations with Good Mark is because I mean I'm also coming from a background, you could write books, you could teach, you could do different, but I just felt like if I try to explain this to people, I don't think they're going to be able to hear me. I think the only way is to show people. So when they start seeing every month, here are these groups in all these different countries doing it, then I don't have to tell them. Actually, there's brilliant things happening in other parts of the world. They can just see it. You know what I mean?
yeah, exactly. Exactly. So before you were talking about challenges, okay? Let's say hypothetically you have a time machine, okay? And you can go backward, you can go travel back in time. What would you change that you've done and you consider it was a mistake in your journey, doing or leading with your group of friends or community days? Oh,
We
there
end up
is no
having,
regrets. Come
yeah,
on.
we end up having this conversation actually quite a bit
Ah,
because it
really?
has been, yeah, it's been a really hard journey, right? Like, especially, you know how hard it is for social enterprises to figure out financing. It's particularly hard if you're trying to build a platform, right? It's really hard. And what we keep coming up to is like every time we hit a challenge, I mean, I'm really blessed because we've got all these people involved, but there's 3 core stewards, and we've all worked together for a really long time, long before Good Market. And we all worked together during war and during natural disaster, and we've been through terrorist attacks and all sorts of things. So our ability to hit a challenge and it looks like there's no way through it, and to find out some solution, we have been practicing that for years and years and years and years, right? Like anything there's almost nothing you could throw at us that would feel right. Like anything that comes up, we're like, okay, how are we going to deal with this? So because of that, each of the things that works well now, it's because we hit a problem in the past. And we keep saying, like, yes, it's been hard, but there's no shortcuts, right? Like if you're trying to do this kind of work, and what we're all doing of trying to like shift things and solve problems, it's the obstacles that you hit that force you to be creative, that push you to think in different ways, that make you find new solutions that maybe aren't being used in other places. So there's definitely there's a no regrets feeling from that perspective, right?
Yeah,
Does
yeah,
that
yeah.
make
No,
sense?
no, you shouldn't. But I always think, oh, I could have done this better, And also like it's me who I tend to be more pragmatic. I look back and then I see if I made a mistake, I try to, amend it throughout the
Yeah.
way, right? Which I think is very important. Look, I'm always trying to reflect on our ecosystem and the people that we work with and everything. But one of the questions that I always have is what are the drivers of people like you or your community behind these kind of projects and why they doing this? So I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you
Yes.
why is that? I mean, what do you became like? Why do you want to change the world? What is your inspiration? So I'm trying to poke more. I try to poke
Yeah.
just more inside you. So
I'm,
how
I'm
is that?
hoping that as you do this podcast series that you ask everybody, because this probably is one of my favorite parts about this movement, right? It's because everybody has such different entry points, right? Like I love that. I love that, like for some people, if they had kids and it was like a wake up, or, like they'll just have some life experience that pushes them in a different way, right? For me, I think there's two things that made it easier for me to go this path. I mean, one, the big driver for me has always been just an absolute love for the living world, like for ecosystems and for nature. And I grew up in a rural area with, yeah, just like I deeply care about and feel connected to the environment. And so a huge driver in that, and people are part of that for me. And so a huge driver is looking at the situation ecologically. That's my underlying driver, right? Is like, and the only way that I know how to move in the world with the current environmental situation is to do whatever I can to push in that direction, and also to be grateful for all the other people also trying to push in that direction. So that to me, I think was a driver. I think the thing that made it easier for me is I have scoliosis, and I had it young and bad. So my spine's curved, and I think if I had had internet at the time, I would have been able to learn more and everything. But I had a doctor that told me when I was very young that, like, if I didn't have surgery, that I was going to die. And then when they was going to have the surgery, they made it sound like there was a good chance that I might not make it. In retrospect, maybe that wasn't true. But being told that at a young age and having to like think through all of that, everything else is a bonus. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Wow.
once
How old were you?
I first started wearing like a back brace when I was 9, and then I had the surgery when
Wow.
I was 13, and so, and I wore a brace after that as well. So like through that whole period, and so I feel like you hear this a lot from people that have experienced cancer, have had near-death experiences or something. Once you realize how short and precious this all is, right? And we've got kind of one shot, and like anything, every day is just this gift and a bonus, right? It's really freeing. It kind of helps set everything into perspective of like what's actually important and where do we want to spend our time, right? So there are certain things that would have been the safe, easy way, but I don't think I had the same kind of, I had certain fears that I didn't have anymore that made it easier to pick the way that felt like it matched where my, my gut was telling me. Does that make sense? So I think
Yeah.
for me, that was a huge factor that made things a lot easier.
You know, this is incredible because when we met you, you are such a lovable person. I mean, of course, people who don't know you, honestly, like you don't, I mean, common in our sector, we also have like cocky people, right? Like people who are like a bit snot, even, but it's not the case with you. So it's fantastic how, you are able to kind of share this love, as you put it, into the world, right?
Yeah.
So do you think until now, right? Because of course change is hard. Change, entails time. Uh, do you think has it been worth it?
Oh gosh, you mean like which
Like all
part?
this process, yeah, all these
Way beyond 100%. Yes.
fantastic,
100%.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And the beautiful thing is when you start off on kind of entering into this space, right? I think that one of the really key things is finding community in whatever form that takes. Other people that you find some kind of a connection with. There's a lot of networks and they have different cultures and some aren't going to be a good fit, and that's okay. Find the ones that are, because that is the bit that kind of keeps everybody's energy going. When you know that you've got other people around you, when you're having a bad day, that you've got people you can talk to, but then this piece of constant inspiration, right? Where we're able to like new initiatives coming up or celebrating success. I am so incredibly inspired. It really bothers me when they talk about, students or young people as future change makers. It's like, that's ridiculous. They're change makers right now. People are solving problems and doing fantastic work in the world, no matter what age they are, right? Watching them come up and being able, like, they're starting so much farther ahead than I think than I did at that age, right? It's incredible. So you're constantly getting little bits of inspiration from the others in this space and the others doing that work. And we need that energy to keep going, right? And so that's a motivation. I think all the people I know that have this next generation, like your kids and my siblings have kids, and thinking about wanting to create a better world for them is an inspiration. So it's about finding energy to keep going, because there's no question this isn't easy, but it's also creative, really fun, and there's lots of inspiration.
Wow. Like we've been a lot into personal development. I mean, of course, as anybody, myself, I've been to psychotherapy, because I've been, everybody has ups and downs, right?
Yeah.
And one of the questions that I'm always ask myself in the morning, not of every morning, not, but in general, is what I want to leave to the world. Okay. I mean, what I want people who come after me, what I want to do to be remembered.
Yeah.
So what is yours? I mean, what would you like people?
Yeah. I'm not. I'm not worried about, I'm not thinking about being remembered. I see it more as, the shift we're working on is a multi-generational work, right? And so it's been all about learning as much as I can from all of the people who did foundational work before. And now being in a role, I feel like I'm kind of now in kind of an in-between space where I get to, like, anybody who's coming up behind, being able to do whatever I can to support them to come up. So I think that's more the space, like, passing the baton and helping the next group come up. That would be, that's more where my focus is at the moment.
Although I have to tell you that you'll be remembered. Like, I know it's not your call, but you will, which is fantastic. Okay, the last thing, no, the last thing actually. What book or perhaps a film or movie that inspired you, you'd like to share or maybe to recommend to the audience? Something that you say, listen, I've seen this or I've read this. Try. It's gonna perhaps make an impact on you.
Yeah. I have a really, really long list.
Wow.
But
Okay. So
I'm gonna give two. So the thing is that there's a lot of people that have done wonderful work on the academic side, right? But that's harder to translate. I can't hand that to a family member and say, like, hey, read this, right? And there's people that have done a good job of, like, pulling things together and making it in a form that it's easier for people to read, right? So one would be, I would recommend Kate Rayworth's Donut Economics for people who haven't read it already, as a way to kind of get a summary of a lot of thinking in this space, right? She's read so many other things and put it together in an easy format with pictures to help understand. There's another recent book that I would actually also recommend, and I think feels really relevant for right now. Very, very recent. It came out in October. So there's an author named Anand Giridharadas who wrote a book called Persuaders. And so there's this feeling right now often that the people who are different than us can't be changed, right? There's a big polarization happening in a lot of countries, right? I see it in Sri Lanka, I see it in the US, I see it in a lot of countries, right? And the whole work of being able to collaborate with people that might be different than you or have different views, and continuing to work together and talking about how do we get to a better future. He's done a beautiful job of going out and actually talking to people that do that work and sharing their insights and stories. So it's very much like, it feels like a story. It's a fun read. It's an easy read. But it pulls out a lot of themes that match experiences that I've had about how do we make change in the world? How do we work with people that might be different? How do we collaborate and build coalitions? So that would be another one. Those are both books that are fun reads, right? Like, they're not like a dense, heavy read. There are many, many other books and films that at some point I should make a list, but that I would recommend. But I would put those two out. One is more about the political side and pushing change that way, and the other is a different way of thinking about the economy.
wow, fantastic, Amanda. That was an amazing conversation. It was almost 2 hours. I'm sorry about that,
Gonna
but
have to edit it way down.
I did really enjoy that. Honestly, that was beautiful to that you shared your story. So thanks for that.
This is the only space I have done that.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just gonna turn this off. Wait.